me ask you a question. How many miracles are there in the Bible? Many? Just a few? Is there a definite number? Yes, there is a definite number of miracles in the Bible, my friends. And you can know it, for sure. Are you familiar with a mirage? Something that only appears real or possible, but in fact isn't? Technically, a mirage is an optical illusion. When the atmospheric conditions are just right, they work on our eyes and brains as the organs of sight and produce mirages. The mirage can be torturous to a thirsty person melting in a desert. You think you see an oasis, but it's just a mirage. My friends, when Americans read the Bible, the cultural conditions are right for producing mirage after mirage after mirage. We are guilty of a spurious familiarity. We think we know what we are reading, but in reality, we are many times clueless as to what is actually going on, what exactly is being communicated, and who the author of this biblical document we read really was. Let's test your eyes for mirages and spurious familiarity. Go through your Bible looking for the word miracle. If it's a good translation in this regard, such as the New American Bible Revised Edition, you shouldn't be able to find a single use of the word. But why? How can that be? I thought the Bible is full of miracles, you might exclaim. Well, you thought wrong, due to the mirage of spurious familiarity. Nowhere does the Bible use the term miracle. That word is unbiblical. The Bible speaks about signs and wonders, or portents, works of power or mighty deeds, or simply works, but never miracles. To even attempt a biblical study of miracles is probably illegitimate. Why? The Hebrew language simply has no equivalent for the English post-Enlightenment concept, miracle. But that doesn't stop English translators. Whenever you read the Bible, always remember that old Italian proverb, tradutori traditori. Translators are traitors. Why? Because they are inconsistent, and they often misrepresent the original author, in this case, the biblical authors. In so doing, they have enabled contemporary readers to impose their post-Enlightenment understanding of miracle onto documents that neither use the word nor communicate that meaning. Indeed, there is no Greek or Hebrew word in the Bible that can be translated into our English word miracle, meaning something contrary to the laws of nature. Science, laws of nature, and violations to the laws of nature are just not part of the Bible, folks. They're not part of the ancient Israelite consensus reality. So they could never have thought of stories like Jesus calming the sea as a miracle. Wonder? Absolutely. Something marvelous? You bet. But not miracle. It's like triangle. You can see a triangle and its angles, or you can have an idea of triangle. The idea of triangle is different than the image of a triangle. And for you to be able to have the idea of triangle, you have to first have the idea of angle. Because you can't conceive of a triangle without first conceiving of an angle. Even if you come to the concepts simultaneously, the concept triangle depends logically on angle. Angle logically comes before triangle. And this also applies to miracles, violations of the physical laws of the universe. How can you have a violation of the physical laws governing the universe, a miracle, unless you first have physical laws governing the universe? Well, the world of the Bible, my friends, had no concept of physical laws governing the universe. Ergo, they could never have conceived of miracles. There are different works in the Old Testament that speak of marvels and marvelous things, but never miracle. When an Israeli mom, delighted that her collegian daughter comes home with great grades, and she says, "Niflot, marvelous, wonderful," she's not saying, "Oh my God, my daughter who's dumb as dirt violated the physical laws of the universe." No, she's saying, "Wonderful, marvelous, my very capable daughter studied well, and it paid off." Marvels and wonders, niflot, this is how God's deeds are described in the Hebrew Bible. Marvelous, wonderful. And this is how Jesus' deeds are described in the New Testament. But there are no miracles in the Bible. If by miracles we mean post-Enlightenment violations of physical laws governing the universe or the laws of nature. Our ancestors in the faith did not know about laws of nature. They were familiar with regularity of occurrences. When something out of the ordinary happened, or something irregular occurred, they marveled at it, or were struck with wonderment. Whatever occurred had to have a personal cause. They thought some person was responsible for it. If no human person, no human agent could be identified, then it was attributed to an agent that is other than human, meaning a spirit or a demon, or perhaps even the highest God. The New Testament preference for mighty deeds usually includes God, directly or indirectly through a human agent in context. Human agents of mighty deeds in the Bible can be viewed as brokers between God, the patron, and God's people, the clients. The proper response to a gift brokered from a patron is to sing the praises of that patron far and wide. There is only one occurrence of mighty deeds in the essay we call Hebrews, and God is clearly identified as the agent. The purpose of these mighty deeds is to give divine testimony to the rescue or salvation announced by the cosmic Lord Jesus and confirmed for believers by those who heard that message. So how many miracles are there in the Bible? Well, like I said at the beginning, you can know the definite number: 0.
Human consciousness. Dreams take place in human consciousness, a rather complex dimension of the human person. While we have learned very much about human consciousness, there is still much more that eludes and puzzles researchers. Anthropologists who study and compare many cultures point out that the state of consciousness that we in the West consider ordinary or normal is actually a construct, not really a fixed fact of existence at all. Indeed, our ordinary state of consciousness is, in many ways, quite arbitrary. In other words, human consciousness is capable of a wide horizon of potentials that each culture shapes into a fixed and stable state. This state of consciousness adapts the individual more or less successfully to survive in his or her culture's consensus reality. What is consensus reality? Let's look at our consensus reality as Western Americans. Long before you and I came into existence, our respective Western culture had evolved into an agreement, a consensus on how to view and interpret the real. It was not a democratic enterprise on which each member of this society voted or chose to agree or disagree concerning the interpretation of the real. That's not what consensus means. Consensus should not imply anything democratic. We are enculturated, some would say programmed, some would say conditioned, some would even say brainwashed into our culture's consensus reality. And every culture has a pragmatic conscious state or a consensus reality. And different cultures have different consensus realities. Some extremely different than United States consensus reality. Here is our consensus reality, symbolized. We are socialized and enculturated to accept introspective individualism, and our core cultural value is instrumental activism. Do, do, do. Go, go, go. Win, win, win. Our trinity of sports, baseball, football, and basketball, exemplify and celebrate this core cultural value. In that culture, other than human persons densely populating the winds around us, called spirits, are very much a normal part of their consensus reality, the consensus reality of the Bible. And even though spirits, other than human persons densely populating the winds around us, are a normal, ordinary part of Middle Eastern consensus reality, the world of the Bible, in our Western culture, generally speaking, they are not. One anthropologist, Vincent Crapanzano, has enumerated more than 35 states of consciousness that all human beings are capable of. Let's look at a few. One alternate state of consciousness that human beings are capable of are called dreams. Dreams are vivid sensory-motor series of thoughts, images, memories, emotions, and sensations. Seeing, hearing, touching. Curiously not smell. You don't smell and dream. With a narrative structure experienced during sleep. One of over 35 different states of consciousness or awareness. The daydream is yet another state of consciousness. Daydreams are spontaneous, subjective experiences in a no task, no stimulus, no response situation, including unintended thoughts that intrude inadvertently into the execution of intended mental tasks and undirected ideas in thought sampling during wakefulness. Nightmares are yet another alternate state of consciousness experience. They are an unpleasant, rapid eye movement dream, usually in the early morning hours, that can cause a strong emotional response from a mind, typically fear, but also despair, anxiety, and great sadness. Incubation dreams or lucid dreams are yet another alternate state of consciousness experience. They are any dream during which the dreamer is aware that they are dreaming. During lucid dreaming, the dreamer may be able to exert some degree of control over the dream characters, narrative, and environment, and can even solve problems. Hallucinations are another type of consciousness state. They are vivid, substantial perceptions in the absence of external stimuli that have the qualities of something located in external objective space. Dissociative identity disorder is a mental disorder and another alternate state of consciousness experience, found on the dissociative spectrum, characterized by the appearance of at least two distinct and relatively enduring identities, or dissociated personality states, that alternately show up in a person's behavior, accompanied by memory impairment for important information not explained by ordinary forgetfulness. Yet another of the 35 different states observed of consciousness or awareness. What's moving, the black or the white? Illusions are yet another alternate state of consciousness. So when something in our perception stresses our percepts to the max and beyond. Distortions of the senses or the senses stressed to their limits, revealing how the brain normally organizes and interprets sensory information. Here is another alternate state of consciousness. Joan of Arc. Visions are yet another alternate state of awareness. They are experiences of seeing someone or something in a dream or trance, or as a supernatural apparition. And they can have a powerful transformative effect on individuals and history. These are just a few of the many levels of human consciousness.
Let's talk about neuroscience. Something in the last 30 years has significantly developed concerning how do we explain our human experiences and how the brain works in them, especially. What neuroscience can do by hooking up electrodes to the skull and scientifically probing and scanning brain activity while people are experiencing shifts in consciousness, experiencing bright, blinding white light color, is to register different brain states. In the Synoptic Gospels, when Jesus was transfigured on the mountain, how was he described? His clothing became blinding white light, shining white light, brilliant white color. All these instances in such cases throughout the Bible of intense white light indicates to the biblical characters and authors God's holy presence. That is their theological interpretation. In fact, in the ancient tradition of Israel, and indeed throughout almost every religious tradition we have encountered, blinding white light is associated with the holy, with the gods, and the realm of the gods. So, almost every religious tradition on earth associates the experience of blinding white light with being in the presence of God or the gods. This is a theological interpretation. And that's what you get in the Bible, which is not a scientific book or library. But what about neuroscience? How does neuroscience interpret the experience of blinding white light? Well, it is to see the individual as definitely experiencing trance. And that can be determined through the brain tracings. The research has been worked out by Andrew Newberg of the University of Pennsylvania, together with his late research partner, Eugene de Aquili. They wired up Carmelite nuns while they prayed and while they were meditating. The research has expanded to include representatives from other faith traditions and religions as well. These brain states are pan-human experiences. As we will see later, Paul's alternate state of consciousness experience was as real as Moses's. And alternate states of consciousness experiences are from one side of the Bible, one of the creation stories in Genesis, all the way to the book of Revelation. To better grasp all of this and how it relates to biblical dreams, we should ask, how did ancient folks think about dreams? Plato, the philosopher, was skeptical about the divine nature of dreams. He notes that all women especially, and sick folk everywhere, and those who have been in peril or distress, as well as those who have had a slice of good fortune, are wont to build shrines or found temples on the basis of dreams. Rather disparaging, no? Aristotle denied that God communicated to anyone in dreams, because ordinary people dream. And why would God want to speak to ordinary people? Says Aristotle, it is absurd to hold that it is God who sends such dreams, and yet that he sends them not to the best and wisest, but to any chance persons. You see, Plato and Aristotle were elites. You have to ask yourself, how much of a percentage of the ancient Mediterranean world were elites? Then you have to ask, is the opinion on dreams of Plato and Aristotle, is that a fair sampling of how most people in the ancient Mediterranean world, the world of the Bible, the world of the Gospels, the world of Jesus, is that how they thought? Is that how they perceived? Is that how they communicated the relevance of dreams and dreaming? Classic scholars remind us that in Hellenistic times there was no single authoritative theory about dreams. Aristotle, Plato, even the well-known Artemidorus had little influence over the vast majority of people. It was the Homeric writings that remained the classic sources on dreams and their interpretation. Indeed, for Hellenic culture, Homer comes pretty close to being sacred scripture. In contrast, the Israelite sage Jesus ben Sira encourages paying attention to visions, especially sent by the Most High. Yet this opinion is very much the exception because in general, Ben Sira says that only the senseless and fools take dreams seriously. He further believes that divination, omens, and dreams are, what our translation reads incorrectly, unreal. What you already expect, the mind depicts. And we have to correct that translation. Literally in Greek, the word translated unreal means idle, foolish, meaningless. The word unreal is inappropriate translation because it contradicts not only Mediterranean cultural consensus reality, but also the insights of psychological anthropology. Clearly, back in Genesis, Joseph and his family did not consider dreams unreal, nor even idle, foolish, or meaningless. On this point, Sirach probably is reflecting a segment of Hellenistic consensus reality of his time and place, rather than the vast majority of Israelites and Mediterraneans. In his famous book on dreams, Oniocritica, Artemidorus was interested in dreams as a key to the forthcoming. He considered them to be primarily predictive forecasts of the forthcoming. In contrast, our modern post-Freudian world, post-Jungian world, views dreams as keys to the unconscious, mirrors of the self. Artemidorus distinguished three kinds of dreams, all dealing with external matters of fact. First is the symbolic dream, which is full of metaphors that need to be interpreted. Consider the Pharaoh's chief butler and chief baker, who were in prison with Joseph in Genesis chapter 40. They each had symbolic dreams. The butler dreamed of a vine with 3 branches whose grapes he squeezed into the Pharaoh's cup for him to drink. Joseph said that after 3 days, the Pharaoh would restore the butler to grace. The baker dreamed he had 3 cake baskets on his head. The uppermost had baked foods for the Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it. Joseph interpreted it to mean that after 3 days, the Pharaoh would hang the butler, and birds would eat his flesh. A second kind of dream is the vision, which pre-enacts a forthcoming event. Peter's dream in Acts chapter 10, verses 9 through 16, is called Horama, the vision, in which he saw a great sheet filled with all kinds of animals, and was commanded to kill and eat to assuage his hunger at that moment. This is an example of the second kind of dream as listed by Artemidorus. Peter objected to eating unclean food, and the voice countered, "What God has cleansed, you must not call common." It happened 3 times. In Peter's subsequent encounter with Cornelius, the God-fearing centurion, whose dream vision instructed Cornelius to summon Peter to his home, Peter grasps the significance of his dream. Experiencing the descent of the Spirit upon Cornelius and his entourage, Peter realized that his dream was indeed predictive of this encounter. This resulted in a change in attitude of certain Judean believers in Jesus toward totally enculturated secular Israelites, civilized Hellene, Greek-speaking, Greek-living, Greek-eating Israelites, secular Israelites who wanted to believe in and accept Jesus as Messiah. The third kind of dream is an oracle, in which the dreamer's parent, or a priest, or a god, or some other respected person reveals clearly a course of action for the dreamer, what the dreamer should do or should not do. This word, krematismos, is the Greek word Paul uses in Romans chapter 11, verse 4, to describe Elijah's encounter with God on the mountain, back in 1 Kings chapter 19. God instructed Elijah there to anoint 2 kings and to anoint his successor as prophet, Elisha. Clearly, in the Israelite tradition, God does communicate in dreams. We have been speaking about dreams and altered states of consciousness, the brain and the nervous system, and God, and how all these relate in the Bible. "Hear my word," said the Lord. "If there is a prophet among you, I, Yahweh, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream," says Numbers chapter 12, verse 6. But to Moses, unique among the prophets of Israel, God speaks mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in dark speech. If dreams belong to dark speech, that means they require interpretation. And the God of Israel is the interpreter of dreams. And sometimes the God of Israel grants this gift to special persons, such as Joseph in Genesis or Daniel in the book of Daniel. Prophets and dreamers in the Bible are usually paired. Samuel the prophet laments when he senses that God has ceased communicating with him, either by prophets or by dreams. Does this mean that prophets were figures in the Bible who were adept at altered states of consciousness experiences? God is understandably disturbed when prophets claim to have received communication in dreams, but God has not so communicated. Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 16 to 32. On the other hand, God uses signs and wonders in apparent confirmation of a dream to test the people's loyalty. Hence, determining whether or not a person had a dream or was lying about it, and then to decide on the interpretation of the dream, while being a common occurrence in ancient Israel, was nevertheless one fraught with the risk of making a terrible mistake, one that could dishonor the God of Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 13, verses 1 to 5. Every word that I command you, you shall be careful to observe, neither adding to it nor subtracting from it. If there arises in your midst a prophet or a dreamer who promises you a sign or wonder, saying, "Let us go after other gods, whom you have not known, and let us serve them," and the sign or wonder foretold to you comes to pass, do not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer. Notice how prophet and dreamer go together. That tells you how prophets receive the word. For Yahweh your God is testing you to know whether you really are attached to Yahweh your God with all your heart and soul. Yahweh your God shall you follow, and him shall you fear. His commandments shall you observe, and to his voice shall you listen. Him you shall serve, and to him you shall hold fast. In comparison to the Old Testament, the New Testament reports far fewer dreams. Scholars sometimes distinguish between dreams and visions, but anthropologists caution that one should not press the distinction, because actually both dreams and visions overlap, and both belong to the category of altered states of consciousness experiences. An example of this overlap is the description in the document called Matthew of the Transfiguration as a vision, which could also be called a waking dream. Jesus, John, James, and Peter all have an altered state of consciousness experience, a waking dream, a vision, in which something from God is communicated to them, namely the identity of Jesus and his vocation. In the Gospel according to Matthew, Joseph, the father of Jesus, and the Magi receive instructions for conduct in a dream, and Pontius Pilate's wife has an ominous dream involving Jesus. Matthew chapter 1, verse 19 to 21. Joseph, her husband, since he was a righteous man, yet unwilling to expose her to shame, decided to divorce her leniently. Such was his intention when, look, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary your wife into your home. For it is through a Holy Spirit, a good wind, a good breath, that this child has been conceived in her. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Look, that's Joseph receiving information and direction via an altered state of consciousness experience. Matthew chapter 2, verse 13. When they had departed, look, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you. Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. Matthew chapter 2, verse 12. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi, who definitely were not only 3 people, departed for their country by another way. Look at all this information and direction coming via altered states of consciousness. Matthew chapter 27, verse 19. While Pontius Pilate was still seated on the bench, his wife sent him a message. Have nothing to do with that righteous man. I suffered much in a dream today because of him. It seems that we are hardwired by God for experiencing God in over 35 different states of consciousness, including dreams, those dreams while asleep, and those dreams that are waking dreams, visions. Scholars observe that up until the 4th century, Christianity did not favor visions of God. But a peculiar development soon took place. Through fasting and prayer and other ascetic practices, anyone could cultivate dreams and stimulate visions. On the other hand, official dream interpreters were forbidden. Such were banned from baptism in the early church. Consideration of interpreting the meanings of dreams and visions has fascinating implications as to the creation of the canon, or the official list of scriptures that make up our Bible. Of various criteria listed for determining which writings were to be included in the canon and which were to be excluded, curiously, inspiration is omitted. The reason, apparently, is that since all the earliest followers of Jesus were filled with the Spirit, meaning very familiar with altered states of consciousness experiences, any claim of inspiration would not have been very useful as a way of distinguishing canonical from extra-canonical Christian writings. In both Paul's writings, as in the 4th Gospel, Jesus himself is the revelation of God. The experience of Jesus raised by God was a crucial event for Jesus' followers in the post-apostolic generations. When the risen Jesus appears, he is generally not immediately recognized. This is normal in descriptions of alternate reality. Interactions with the risen Jesus, as described in various early Jesus groups, can best be explained in terms of experiences generally unavailable to human perception in a culture such as ours. In other words, during the centuries before and after Paul and the Johannine Jesus group, countless persons reported a range of visions, dreams, and appearances involving celestial entities from the sky vault. There is no reason not to take the experiences of these persons seriously, at their word, and to interpret what they have to say within the framework of their own non-Western culture, rather than our 21st century Western one. Again, contemporary cognitive neuroscience has researched and described in considerable detail the function of the brain and nervous system in human consciousness, in its many variations. The average human person changes levels of consciousness many times a day: sleep, waking time, daydreaming, road trance, and so forth. Human beings, again, are capable of experiencing more than 35 different levels of consciousness. It would be quite anachronistic and ethnocentric for us Western people to take our post-Enlightenment, post-industrial revolution, technologically obsessed society as normative for judging anyone other than ourselves. For most of the world, even today, a report of alternate states of consciousness would be considered quite normal, regular, and routine. The variety of persons witnessing appearances of Jesus raised from the dead suggests an experience of altered state of consciousness. This may be difficult for us Westerners to believe because we have been enculturated to be selectively inattentive to such states of awareness, except in dreams and under the influence of controlled substances. Moreover, both in the Synoptic Gospels and in the 4th Gospel called John, there are accounts of the appearances of the resurrected Jesus to the core group of disciples that describe the incident in a rather straightforward manner, much like previous events in the story. The disciples, gathered as a group, gradually come to recognize the resurrected Jesus and interact with him. He appears just as they knew him before the crucifixion: physical, bodily, touchable, sharing food with them. Scholars categorize such accounts as a group appearance type. By contrast, in the New Testament, there are also accounts in which the risen Jesus appears in a sudden and unexpected manner to one or two individuals who are somewhat distraught, and he addresses them so that eventually they come to recognize him. For examples, Mary Magdalene in John chapter 20, and the Emmaus disciples in Luke chapter 24. Scholars label these accounts as a singular appearance type. Such singular appearances of the gospel tradition are like those appearances to Paul in the book of Acts. or Stephen, or the astral prophet John of Patmos. In the New Testament, when such singular appearances occur, generally after Pentecost, Jesus appears from or in the sky in brilliant light and is perceived through some altered mode of perception, including ecstatic conditions. It was the group appearance type that was recognized and required in those Jesus groups that succeeded the Jesus movement as the basis for apostolic authority, with apostolic significance, normative, legitimate, legal. Paul, of course, did not experience such a group appearance type of Jesus. His experiences of the risen Lord were rather the singular type of visions or waking dreams. The type of singular appearance in a vision later became common among Gnostics for establishing their authority in face of competing apostolic claims wielded by non-Gnostic bishops. The Gnostic Jesus group people claimed continuing revelations of Jesus through visions. And this is one of the reasons why proto-Orthodox fathers like Justin Martyr did not read or trust Paul, because Paul was recontextualized and championed by the Valentinian Gnostics and by people like Marcion of Sinope, who favored the singular appearance type. To eliminate Gnostic claims to authority based on such singular visionary experiences, yet at the same time, to include the letters attributed to Paul and the book of Revelation among traditionally valid authoritative witness to Jesus, non-Gnostic leadership set up a canon or norm of Scripture for Jesus groups. Synesius of Cyrene, a 4th century convert to Christianity, said, "At 24 years of age, it is inexcusable for a man still to need an interpreter of his own dreams." It seems that this movement to promote dreams and visions among larger numbers of people popping into existence around the 4th century in Christianity was a response to the decision to close the biblical canon. Dreams and visions give all people a potential direct link with God, holy and absolute mystery. And unlike Scripture, they do not require any but personal interpretation. The church father Tertullian wrote what is considered to be the first proto-Orthodox treatment on dreams. He believed that the majority of humankind came to know God through dreams. The reference he gives is to the one true God of those labeled Christians, though in Carthage, Tertullian lived among men and women who were predominantly polytheists of various traditions. Tertullian claimed that dreams came from 3 sources: from God, from the devil, or from the human soul. Much later, Jerome reported his dream of being summoned before the judge, who asked, "Who are you?" When St. Jerome replies, "I am a Christian," the judge answers, "You lie. You are a follower of Cicero, not of Christ." Then he received lashes of the whip and suffered pangs of conscience. Consider the sources Tertullian gives as to the origin of dreams: God, the devil, or the human soul. How did St. Jerome determine and decide that his dream was real and wasn't from himself or from the devil, but rather from God? Answer: Jerome could feel the pain on his shoulders long after the dream had ended. According to Tertullian, most dreams come from the devil. Dreams of the heretics and schismatics, the waking visions of those of the Gnostics and Montanists, surely come from the devil, according to Tertullian. Tertullian thought that dreams can play a double role. On the one hand, they can establish and confirm a truth. But on the other hand, dreams can overturn authority rebelliously, which some say is why they were so important to schismatics and heretics. Thirdly, following the Stoics, Tertullian says that dreams come from the soul. According to Tertullian, sleep is for the body, but not for the soul. The body rests, but the soul does not, which is why, according to Tertullian, we dream. To Tertullian, sleep is like death. In sleep, the soul gets separated from the body, according to his view, so that dreams allowed one to communicate with the dead, or those who live on in alternate reality. As such, dreams would be a perfect vehicle for divine revelation, divine self-disclosure, and frequently offered solutions to daily problems. Waking from a dream, according to Tertullian, is like resurrection from the dead. Tertullian borrowed many of his ideas from Hellenistic sources, but he insisted that Christian dream interpretation had to be different. It isn't until the 7th century, with Isidore of Seville, that scholars recognized the birth of a specifically Christian orientation to interpreting dreams. The popularity of dream analysis in the modern world often leads enthusiasts to apply post-Freudian, post-Jungian insights and interpretations to the Bible. It is well to remember that people in the Bible, like 80% of the current population of the planet, are collectivistic personalities. This means that they are not only non-introspective, but anti-introspective. Western psychology does not apply to them. Their understanding of self is the group self. The function of dreams in antiquity was that of all experience of altered states of consciousness. 1. To impart new information from God. 2. To provide a solution to a problem in life, a course of action, a decision, and so on. Even so, we clearly see how our ancestors in the faith struggled to distinguish true dreams, that is, authentic communication from God, from a lie. Divine revelation is central to the Bible, a library filled up with various and frequent accounts of visions, just one type of altered state of consciousness. Cognitive neuroscientists, together with anthropologists studying cross-cultural psychology, define altered states of consciousness as conditions in which sensations, perceptions, cognition, and emotions are altered. Such states are characterized by changes in sensing, perceiving, thinking, and feeling. In the noble attempt at becoming truly considerate Bible readers to our Middle Eastern ancestors in the faith, hopefully, these YouTube presentations will help us illuminate biblical passages from such new discoveries in cognitive neuroscience, psychological anthropology, and related disciplines, which have made giant strides in recent decades in understanding the human brain, nervous system, and how they work. In a previous video presentation, we mentioned that the decision to close the biblical canon in the 4th century generated a movement of large numbers of people to promote dreams and visions, altered states which offered a more direct link to God. A very curious story comes from the 5th century document, The Sayings of the Fathers. It reports that the Christian abbot Olympius once told a story about how a pagan priest came to his monastery and spent the night there. When the pagan priest observed the lifestyle of the Christian monks, he asked, "Leading this kind of life, do you see anything of your God?" To which the abbot Olympius replied, "No." The pagan priest then said, "When we, pagans, perform the sacred rites for our God, he hides nothing from us, but reveals his mysteries to us. But you Christians, after so many labors, vigils, periods of silence, and ascetic exercises, say, 'We see nothing?' It would seem that if you see nothing, you keep evil thoughts in your hearts, which separate you all from your God. And because of this, he does not reveal his mysteries to you." The abbot reported the words of the priest to the elders, who marveled and said, "Yes, it must be so." We Christians, along with our Jewish and Muslim brothers and sisters, talk about God and in the name of God all the time. From where do we derive our information about God? How does God communicate with us? Under what circumstances and conditions do such communications happen? How can we be sure that we have in fact been in touch with God, holy and absolute mystery, rather than with our own wish projections and imaginings, as Sigmund Freud contended? Does God communicate with others beside Catholics and other Christians? Or is God hidden by deliberate design from great segments of the human family? Is the form of divine self-disclosure or revelation verbal, dramatic, mystical, historical, social, political, natural, Cosmic? Or what? And what is communicated or disclosed? Does revelation consist of facts about God and the other world? Or is it God's very self that is being communicated? And would we have known that which is revealed, even if it had not been revealed? If God does indeed reveal, why is it that so many people seem indifferent to or ignorant of divine revelation? Or is it perhaps very difficult for most humans to pick up God's signals of transcendence? The reality of God, my friends, can neither be proved nor disproved by rational arguments alone. No argument against God's existence is so convincing that belief becomes impossible. No argument for God's existence is so convincing that belief becomes inevitable. To judge that God has been revealed in a particular person, event, or mystical experience is precisely that, a judgment, no matter how reasonable or informed it might be. In the beginning was the interpretation. Indeed, there are many religions rather than just one, because, among other things, as the pastor, the true author behind the document called 1 Timothy, says, God, who alone has immortality, who dwells in unapproachable light, and whom no human being has seen or can see. We can never be absolutely certain that we have had an experience of God, or whether we have correctly perceived, interpreted, and expressed that experience. Since God can become available to us only in some bodily or sacramental way, the self-communication of God will always be conditioned by the historical situation of the person or community to which God is disclosed. Revelation is received, in other words, according to the mode of the receiver. The God question, therefore, is in actuality the reverse side of the question of human existence. Who am I? And who are we? Because Christians are no less human, no less historically situated than others, the Christian perception, interpretation, and expression of the experience of God in faith is also, in principle, subject to ambiguity, error, and distortion. On the other hand, it is the distinctively Christian conviction that God has been disclosed so clearly and so distinctively in Jesus of Nazareth that there is no possibility of fundamental error in the perception, interpretation, or formal doctrinal expression of the experience of God in faith. Fundamental distortion is possible in secondary matters of belief. Ambiguity, however, is always possible because of the ineffable character of God and the inherent limitation of human language. Returning to the story of the abbot Olympius, what exactly did the pagan priest mean by the Christian monks having evil thoughts which blocked access to God despite their many wonderful practices that should induce an experience with God? Do we 21st century Western people also have such evil thoughts? Are we blocking otherwise available experiences with the divine? And how would we overcome such blockages? The biblical tradition tells us that Jacob, Moses, and Gideon spoke with God face to face. Jacob wrestled with God, asking for his name. Exodus tells us that Moses used to speak with Yahweh face to face, like friends. In Deuteronomy, it is claimed that no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face. Judges 6:22, Gideon laments, "Alas, Lord Yahweh, that I have seen the messenger of Yahweh face to face." Indeed, the Israelite people communicated with God face to face. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 4, "Face to face, Yahweh spoke with you," Hebrew plural, "on the mountain from the midst of the fire." Paul and the author of the letters called John use the phrase face to face to declare how earnestly they yearn to see the recipients of their letters, meaning in person, face to face. I hope to visit you and to speak face to face with you. On the other hand, the biblical tradition also reports the belief that no one can see God and survive. God tells Moses to warn the people, Don't try to break through to the mountain, because they'll come into my presence and they'll be struck dead. In Judges, Manoah laments to his wife, "We will certainly die, for we have seen God." Those who survived such an intense encounter felt very blessed indeed. Have I really seen God and remained alive? The Gospel called John tells us, "For the law was given through Moses. The gift that is the truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only Son, who is turned toward the Father, he has made him known." Wait a minute. No one has ever seen God? What about Moses and Gideon and Abraham and others like Jacob? The pastor, the true author of the document we call 1 Timothy, writes, "God, who alone has immortality, who dwells in unapproachable light, and whom no human being has seen or can see." Interesting. The New Testament points out in different documents that no one has ever seen God. And yet, as we said before in a previous presentation, we talk about God and in the name of God all the time. Question: from where do we derive our information about God? How does God, unapproachable God, communicate with us? Under what circumstances and conditions does such communication happen? In some books, the Bible does speak about those seeing God face to face. But in other books, it says no one is able to see God directly, that is, face to face. What are we to make of these apparently conflicting reports? Speaking with God face to face and seeing God, common expression for Israelite pilgrimage to the temple, are concrete verbal expressions of an intense human experience of God. We can deduce this from the nature of personal face-to-face encounters in Middle Eastern culture. The meeting is indeed intense. Face to face, face to face, face to face, intense, unforgettable, impactful. Very different than our comfort zones in the Western world. People in Mediterranean cultures are comfortable standing really close, while people in Western culture tend to keep a space of 12 to 16 inches between each other. Moreover, in our Western world, people do not touch each other as spontaneously or readily as do people in the Mediterranean. It's not comfortable for us to do that. On elevators, we Westerners attempt to shrink into ourselves to avoid touching others. Same thing on public transportation. So it may be difficult to understand this face-to-face thing in the Bible. In a face-to-face encounter, Middle Easterners stand 6 to 8 inches apart, the normal parameter of personal space. Persons want to experience the breath of the conversation partner, the God-given breath by which a person has life. Hey, God breathed up your nose. I want to breathe that breath of life too. 6 to 8 inches, please. To withdraw that by standing further apart than 6 to 8 inches would be shameful, insulting. The degree of emotional exchange in this encounter, accompanied by frequent touching, is similarly intense. To transpose this total human experience to an encounter with God certainly increases its level of intensity. Whatever seeing God face to face means, it has to be a human peak experience, which can never last that long, because it would be more than a human person could endure and survive. Therefore, to experience God this intensely and survive is wondrous indeed. Isaiah the prophet survived what he experienced as a cauterization of his lips with a burning coal. He's in the presence of Yahweh's temple and declares himself a man of unclean lips and laments that he's going to die. When a dragon constellation, a combustible one, a Zaraph, flies down holding a hot ember with a pair of tongs, which he places on Isaiah's lips to burn his sins away. Jeremiah the prophet felt God touch his mouth in a similar way, intense. Ezekiel the prophet felt the very force of God enter into him when God spoke to the prophet. It was so powerful that Ezekiel was forced onto his feet. Now I want you to recall the story of the abbot Olympius and the pagan priest who wondered why the Christian monks in the 5th century had failed to have visions of God. What did did the pagan priest mean by saying that the Christian monks had evil thoughts which had blocked access to God? If we allow for the stylized form of the pagan priest's explanation of why the monks don't see God despite using all the right techniques, fasting, prayer, meditation practices, and other ascetic techniques, it is possible to clarify the meaning of evil thoughts that separate a human being from God. Modern researchers into human consciousness point out that the body is our common human biological heritage. At the physiological level, every human body is constructed and wired basically the same way. While medical students continue to study the various systems in the human body separately, research indicates that these systems actually communicate with each other in ways we never realized before. Human consciousness also seems to have physiological underpinnings. Changes in levels of consciousness register differently on machines designed to test this. Thus, if the human organism is not malformed or damaged, it has an incredible physiological basis for experiencing various states of consciousness. To phrase it otherwise, the human person is capable of experiencing its creator in the very fiber of the human body, whether in emotions or in awareness. Jacob was physically exhausted after encountering God. He felt as if he had wrestled God all night long. Research indicates that as many as 90% of people on Earth use the biological basis for experiencing God or transcendence or holy and absolute mystery regularly, routinely, spontaneously. They embrace the ability to live life intensely, to plunge without restraint into the total lived experience that opens human consciousness into its deepest levels. And the other 10%, people like us, well, we are hindered by evil thoughts. Contemporary Westerners, that is to say post-industrial Western people, devotees of modern science, have developed a meta-self, a critical observer who monitors and comments on lived experience. This meta-self is a slave master. It will not allow complete abandon. It forbids and prevents yielding of control, total absorption in lived and unmediated experience, which is the essence of highly focused levels of consciousness through which God, holy and absolute mystery, seems to communicate most often to human beings. To use the words of the pagan priest, these scientific convictions are evil thoughts, which hinder people from encountering God. Perhaps it was not very much different with the ancients. When Samuel was ministering under Eli, the sacred author comments, "The word of Yahweh was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision." Question: why did the priest Eli not receive a word from God? Eli's sons were worthless men who'd mistreated those who came to offer sacrifice, particularly the poor. Eli learned about it and scolded them, but they would not listen to him. This suggests that Eli did not raise his sons properly in Mediterranean Middle Eastern fashion, because it is the Middle Eastern patriarch's cultural task to make sure that he can impose his will on his sons and assure unswerving loyalty to himself. Eli's obvious failure as a Mediterranean Middle Eastern father makes it very plausible that obsession with his son's misconduct made it difficult for Eli to be open to communication from the Lord. While it is important to recognize that the initiative of such communication via trance states lies with God, the petitioner must also be prepared for and open to the encounter, not blocked by evil thoughts. Recall the story of the abbot Olympius and his report about the pagan priest who visited his 5th century Christian monastery. The pagan priest enumerated with apparent agreement the techniques which the monks utilized to prepare for their experience of God. Labors, vigils, periods of silence, ascetic exercises. Modern research in cognitive neuroscience has identified these techniques and others that appear to work physiological effects on the human brain and nervous system, which in turn trigger changes in consciousness. One of these is drumming. That is, a rhythmic pattern of beats, Speeding up or slowing down the rhythm produces different levels of consciousness and experiences. In his visions, the prophet Ezekiel heard the sound of a great earthquake. One Context Group biblical scholar experienced an earthquake in 1969 on the 15th floor of a graduate residence hall in St. Louis, Missouri. It gave him the impression that some youngster was skipping rope in the room above his. He was unfamiliar with earthquakes. He became irritated, but the face of his visitor and friend, who had experienced many earthquakes in Puerto Rico, registered a very different emotional expression: terror. This rhythmic shaking was, for the visitor, all too familiar. In his vision, the prophet Isaiah felt the foundations of the temple thresholds shake. Incense or scent is another common stimulant for changing levels of consciousness. Think about the incense that would be used in the temple. Think about pilgrims on the way in ancient Israel to the temple, poor people fasting, whether intentionally or not, and then being greeted by the wafting smell of 24/7 barbecue and incense. You're going to go into trance if you experience such a thing. The prophet Isaiah refers to the smoke that filled the temple, quite likely a combination of incense and smoke from burnt offerings. In his temple vision, the prophet Ezekiel sees the 70 elders, each holding a censer emitting smoke of the cloud of incense. The volume and intensity of the smells in the temple would stimulate visions, thus assuring pilgrims and worshippers of an opportunity to see God. The intense concentration that characterizes an altered state of consciousness can be achieved by fasting and similar practices. Daniel, the prophet, was mourning for 3 weeks. He says, "I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. Then the vision occurred. I was on the great river. As I looked up, I saw a man dressed in linen, with a belt of fine gold around his waist. His body was like chrysolite. His face shone like lightning. His eyes were like fiery torches. His arms and feet looked like burnished bronze, and the sound of his voice was like the roar of a multitude. I alone, Daniel, saw the vision." The description rings true with someone experiencing a deep trance state. Jesus fasted for an even longer period than Daniel. Mark chapter 1, verses 12 to 13. At once the Spirit drove Jesus out into the desert, and he remained in the desert for 40 days, tempted by Satan. He was among wild beasts, and the angels ministered to him. At the end, his filial loyalty was tested in a trance experience. Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. He fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was hungry. The tempter approached and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." He said in reply, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes forth from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and made him stand on the parapet of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and with their hands they will support you, lest you dash your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "Again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." Then the devil took him up to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their magnificence. And he said to him, "All these I shall give you, if you will prostrate yourself and worship me." At this Jesus said to him, "Get away, Satan! It is written, the Lord your God shall you worship, and him alone shall you serve." Then the devil left him, and look, angels came and ministered to him. The temptation of Jesus, found in each of the synoptic gospels, but curiously absent in the one we call John, is really an honor test or trial by ordeal about loyalty to God. God, who proclaimed Jesus as his son, a holy man. Such holy men or women can barter favors with God in alternate reality. The experience and successful passing of this test is one of several steps in the process of becoming an Israelite holy man or shaman. Jesus demonstrates that he has acquired the necessary skills to deal with and control other than human persons, called spirits, something shamans do. His experience in an altered state of consciousness rings true with what we know about the nervous system and brain all human beings share in common. Even if we believe in the incarnation, we have to take the prefix "in" seriously, into a common humanity. Seeing the Word. The word for vision used in 1 Samuel also serves as the title for some prophetic books. The opening line, Isaiah, Nahum, and Obadiah all begin as the vision of the prophet. The visions of the prophets are familiar to readers of the Bible. In the visions, prophets sometimes see things. Could be a boiling pot in the case of Jeremiah, or a field of dry bones in the case of Ezekiel. But they also always hear a message. Ko amar Yahweh, thus saith Yahweh, or some equivalent formula. More curious is the phrase, the word which he saw, or the oracle which he saw. How does one see spoken words or oracles? Is this prophetic shorthand for vision and message? Consider visionaries. Consider a visionary from the time of the church in France being invaded by England. Having experiences of God. Is her brain inventing these things? Is she making it all up as she goes along? How much of the vision is Joan of Arc, the girl, and how much is the living God? And how would you be certain? Where does the soundtrack come from? When she enters the church and sees the light coming through the stained glass picture of St. Michael the Archangel, does she imagine St. Michael the Archangel standing before her? Is she making that up in her head? Or is St. Michael the Archangel actually standing before her? How much of this is signs, and how much of this is an ink blot test? Modern people are obsessed with these kinds of things. When Joan of Arc sees Jesus, the child, does she imagine him being French? Does she imagine the older Prince Jesus, King Jesus, being a French king? What is really going on in her vision experiences? Psychological anthropologists who have investigated worldwide evidence concerning visions and other alternate states of consciousness point out that these experiences have no soundtrack. It is the visionary who provides the soundtrack that reflects the visionary's culture. Therefore, the prophets who saw visions, whether a boiling pot or bones or the constellation throne in the sky vault, also provided a suitable soundtrack that interpreted what they had seen. When we say that the human being provides the soundtrack to the vision experiences, that's not the same thing as saying that the visionary is just making it all up in his or her head. Since God is the creator of the human being, since God did all this hard wiring through evolution, God can work with this. God is always present, never the absent one. But we have to admit that sometimes God works with those who have suffered bad days. And after all of us have suffered bad days, have we not? And bad days color things. We see in the Bible God commanding horrors, slavery, genocidal warfare, rape. God is in the human being, my friends. God is in, therefore, the genocidal nastiness, sure, but not as the one commanding it, orchestrating it, micromanaging it. The bad day is in there also, coloring things. God is not the master engineer or high general sitting up in headquarters somewhere on top of the sky, punching into a cosmic skyboard all the marching orders for everyone everywhere. God is not a cosmic micromanager or a puppeteer. But holy and absolute mystery, called God, did hardwire us human beings through evolution to communicate with God this way. He gave us our nervous systems. Provided there isn't serious tragedy and trauma and terrible wounds to color things, it ought to work very nice. But we need to remember that our image of God creates us, and our image of us distorts God. We were made for these experiences, however, as modern research into cognitive neuroscience and cultural anthropology is showing us. Visions don't come with soundtracks, but the soundtrack, of course, was God-breathed. It was inspired by God. And the most important part of that word inspired is the prefix in. It was indeed God speaking to the prophet. The two elements, divine and human, are so inextricably bound up in the experience of the visionary that it makes perfect sense to say that he saw the word, or that he saw the oracle of the Lord. Dictionaries customarily list the passages that we just mentioned, the word that he saw, the oracle that he saw, as instances of seeing as in an ecstatic state. This, of course, is quite correct from our modern enlightened point of view. It very likely describes in modern terms quite correctly what the ancients experienced in these passages. But we have to ask, is this fair? Is this entirely fair to our ancient Mediterranean ancestors in the faith? They do not seem to have distinguished the variety of meanings of ecstasy identified in our English dictionaries. For example, one Hebrew dictionary describes the scene in which Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel saw God and ate and drank in his presence as a theophany. How does this theophany differ from encountering God, or seeing God face to face at the pilgrimage to the temple, or seeing the Word, or seeing an oracle in an ecstatic state? Remember, all these events are really experiences in altered states of consciousness. Many scholars now see the need for rewriting dictionaries along the lines of semantic domains, such as Greek-English Lexicon of the New Testament based on semantic domains, an excellent book. Nearly all dictionaries reflect the social system of the lexicographer rather than the social system of the people who spoke that ancient language. Hence, we need a new kind of dictionary like this one. The Greek word translated ecstasy, ekstasis, occurs 29 times in the Greek Bible and 7 times in the New Testament. Paul fell into an ekstasis, a trance, in Acts, in which he received the directive from God dictating an immediate course of action: flee Jerusalem. Peter had an ekstasis, a dream, that gave him new instruction from God concerning appropriate foods to eat. These instances correspond to the general purpose of such experiences: to give new information, new insight, a new way of looking at things, or offer advice for a course of action. The other instances of ekstasis are translated amazement, reaction to healings in the Synoptic Gospels and the book of Acts, and to the discovery of the empty tomb and the young man's message about Jesus in the Gospel called Mark. Yet it is also possible that the ancients considered all these events, trances and healings, as amazing. Felicitas Goodman, the anthropologist who, together with Erica Berguignon, conducted most of the pioneering research on altered states of consciousness, grew up in the Hungarian region of Western Romania in a Lutheran setting. Throughout her youth, she regularly experienced altered states of consciousness without smoking anything, drinking anything, or taking anything dubious. At her confirmation, Felicitas was advised to put away such childish things and behave now like an adult. When one of her friends entered the convent, Felicitas asked the same question of her that the old pagan priest had asked of the 5th century monks. Do all these religious experiences and disciplines help you to see your God? Felicitas's friend sadly gave her the same answer: no. As we will see later, Felicitas Goodman's research work on body postures showed that by assuming certain body postures, a human being can experience visions and other altered states of consciousness, such as sky journeys. Once after context group scholar Dr. John Pilch had given a talk on this very subject, a woman in the audience approached him. She told him, "It's funny what you're saying. When I was a young girl, between 4 and 6 years old, I levitated. I did it by leaning forward, and at a certain point, it happened. If I leaned too far, I fell over. I played this levitation game many times." "You didn't do this after that age, when you were older than 6? asked Dr. Pilch. "No," replied the woman. "Why not?" he asked her. "Because my mother told me it was silly," came her sad reply. And that's how it is, ladies and gentlemen. Our parents are always doing that to us, aren't they? Adults will always straighten you out and tell you to be a rational human being and grow up. It seems that the Johannine Jesus group of adults regularly experienced God and the risen Jesus in alternate states of consciousness experiences. That was the point and purpose of the liturgical gatherings, folks. When the author we call John writes, "No one has ever seen God," he apparently is denying claims of those outside his circle, the Johannine Jesus group, to have had that privilege. The Johannine Jesus group regularly and routinely experienced the risen Jesus in their worship more than any other group. All the time, Jesus was present, as he should be in our worship. The Johannine community retained a tradition we would do well to explore and restore. My friends, we have been exploring past several videos the role human consciousness plays in the Bible, particularly in marvels, dreams, and visions. We seem to have been hardwired for experiences of the divine through 35 different states of awareness. With this in mind, let's consider the story found in all the Gospels of Jesus walking on the sea. What exactly is going on in this story? Is Jesus violating the laws of buoyancy? Is he overriding the physical laws of the universe? Is the point of this story that Jesus is so powerful, he can do the impossible with ease? Everyone seems very familiar with the Gospel story describing Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee. He's heading toward his disciples who are in a boat. Taking everything we've been learning, let's turn to the earliest account of this story from the Gospel called Mark. Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 52. Then Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and precede him to the other side toward Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And when he had taken leave of them, he went off to the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was far out on the sea, and he was alone on the shore. He saw that they were tossed about while rowing, for the wind was against them. About the 4th watch of the night, he came toward them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. They had all seen him and were terrified. But at once he spoke with them. "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." He got into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely astounded. They had not understood the incident of the loaves. On the contrary, their hearts were hardened. That is the Markan version of the story. Now let's look at the Matthean version. Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Then Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and precede him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. At once Jesus spoke to them. "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Could he, if it is you, command me to come to you on the waters?" He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind charging, he became afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Kyrie, save me!" Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him, and said to him, "O you of little loyalty, why did you doubt?" After they had gotten into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, having read the Markan and Matthean versions of this story, let's turn to the fourth Gospel, John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and were trying to go across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea rose because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 20 or 30 stadios, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat. They were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land to which they were going. These three stories, while the same, are also pretty different, aren't they, in their details? So once more, my friends, what exactly is going on in these stories of Jesus walking on the sea? Is he doing something that violates the rules of nature? Is he violating science? Is the point of this story that Jesus is so powerful he can do whatever he wants, no matter how impossible or absurd? We're going to explore these questions and a whole lot more, dealing with Jesus walking on the sea in the next several presentations. Having explored three different gospel versions of Jesus walking on the sea, we ask once more, what exactly is going on in these stories? Is Jesus overriding the physical laws governing the universe? What does the story mean? The English phrase inspired by this event, "she thinks she can walk on water," intends to describe somebody who can accomplish the impossible with ease. Like many popular interpretations of the Bible, this one too misses the mark. All human beings actually do walk on water when it rains. However, to talk about someone walking on the sea is an entirely different thing. The Hebrew word hayam and the Greek thalassa translate to English as sea. This is a key word in this gospel story and in the entire biblical tradition. A clearer understanding of that word and reality suggests a new interpretation of this event in the life of Jesus. Let's talk about the sea. Many ancient cultures, including that of Palestine, personified much, if not all, of reality. The sea was no exception. It was not a what, but a who. In the Mesopotamian traditions, Tiamat was the primordial watery source of life, a goddess. Contemporary scholars now discount that Tiamat is the source for the biblical Tehom, which is the word for the deep or abyss, yet both words may share some root meaning. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, the earth is said to be tohu vabohu. Tohu sounds a lot like Tiamat, with darkness over the Tehom, the abyss. In the story of the flood in the 600th year of Noah's life, the great Tehom, this primordial sea abyss, bursts forth. Later on, the fountains of the abyss, the Tehom, are closed. Contemporary biblical scholars correctly recognize that the basic ideas of these Semitic myths derive from a common and shared cultural perspective. The distinctive significance of the biblical tradition among these myths is that the God of Israel controls this potentially unruly sea and does not gain his mastery over it as a result by winning a battle with it. Modern biblical readers must keep these personifications in mind in order to properly appreciate biblical narratives on their own cultural terms. The sea in the Bible is not so much a what, but a who. Now let's get into seas known to biblical people. But in doing that, let's keep in mind what St. Thomas Aquinas and our medieval ancestors in the faith taught us, that all God talk, all theology, is analogy. That is, everything human beings know and say about God is rooted in human experience, which is always culturally interpreted. Bible readers want to know which seas were familiar to biblical people. Even land-bound peasants like Jesus and his followers knew about the Mediterranean Sea. In the Bible, the Mediterranean Sea is often referred to simply as Hayam, the sea, and sometimes the Great Sea. The psalmist presents a vivid description of how this body of water could turn violent and destructive. The voice of Yahweh is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. Yahweh over the mighty waters. Because this watery presence looms so large west of the land of Israel, this Hebrew word for sea, Hayam, also served as the designation for the compass direction west. And you can see why. A great other-than-human person, the Mediterranean Sea. Also famous from the Bible are other seas, such as the Sea of Reeds, usually translated Red Sea in Exodus. This is the sea that is crossed by ancient Hebrews in their escape from Egypt, or perhaps marsh or swamp. It is difficult to locate geographically. The sea located in the Araba region south of Palestine, the deepest point on the surface of the planet Earth, is called by different names. The Salt Sea, the Sea of the Plain, or the Eastern Sea. Its high concentration of salt and other minerals permits no visible life to exist in it, hence the ancient Roman name for it, the Dead Sea. This name is deceptive, though, because even though this sea is usually calm, occasionally severe and dangerous thunderstorms do develop. This is quite in keeping with the dense nature of this personified body of water. The Dead Sea, not so dead. And what you're looking at is not so much a body of water, a what, but a who. Finally, there is the Sea of Galilee, which figures so prominently in the Synoptic Gospels we call Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Its most ancient name was Chenereth, from the Hebrew word for harp, perhaps describing the shape of the lake, or perhaps the sound of its waters. In the Hellenistic and Roman periods, it was called Gennesaret. The Gospel we call John calls it the Lake of Tiberias. Situated about 640 feet below sea level, its size today is 13 miles long and 8 miles wide at its widest part. The Sea of Galilee. By the way, it's important when you read these stories to have a map handy, to see where Jesus came from, the region he and his ministry began in. This is a personified body of water, a who and not a what. Of special interest is the wind pattern on this sea. Two large valleys on the west side usher in strong afternoon breezes from the west, particularly during the dry season. These can quickly churn up waves on the peaceful waters to a height of 7 or more feet. In the winter, a similar wind pattern from the east can produce the same effect. No experienced fisherman would sail in such storms, and if he were caught in a sudden squall, he would do anything possible to return to shore quickly. This personified body of water has a tempestuous nature. Now, Jesus, walking on the Sea of Galilee toward his disciples who are in a boat, has been variously interpreted. Some scholars consider it a nature miracle, which means an action that clearly surpasses the so-called laws of nature. Miracle is a nice post-Enlightenment word, a violation or an overriding of the physical laws governing the universe. While this might make sense to the modern post-Enlightenment mind, our ancient ancestors in the faith lived by the simple perception that whatever happened actually happened. While it may have been a singular, rare, or infrequent experience, it wasn't contrary to anything. If our ancestors in the faith saw it, they believed that it really happened. If it was beyond customary human ability, what they saw, it had to have some other than human explanation, but still a personal explanation. Everything that happens, people in this world ask, not what happened, but who done it. Some person had to be responsible for it. Other scholars consider this event to be an appearance of the risen Jesus that has been retrojected back into his earthly life. They connect the story linguistically by the sea, upon the sea, particularly with John chapter 21, and also with the literary form of other resurrection appearances. These biblical scholars also deny any real parallels between this story of Jesus walking on the sea with Old Testament stories of walking on or through the sea, like, for example, Job chapter 9, verse 8, and also similar stories in pre-gospel polytheistic literature about Orion, Poseidon, Euphemus, Aphrodite, and others. These scholars correctly note that none of these stories could have served as a model for the evangelists, but they neglect to take seriously the fact that such perspectives about certain kinds of persons coursing over the personified sea were quite common in the ancient Mediterranean world. Moreover, these biblical scholars do not provide a satisfactory explanation of what the first readers or hearers of such a story about Jesus walking on the sea would have gotten out of it. Invariably, in these scholars, there is too hasty a segue into a theological interpretation linked with the risen Lord and the Eucharist. What is going on in these accounts about Jesus walking on the sea? Is Jesus actually walking on water, H2O, in the same way that other human beings walk on the solid ground? If you respond, yes, he is this then a violation of scientific laws? Are you imagining that Jesus is violating scientific laws, physical laws governing the universe? Were the people who wrote these stories part of a culture that was familiar with science and scientific laws? In science, we Western people recognize buoyancy force. When a boat goes into the water, the ship displaces so much water that it is kept up, it doesn't sink. Objects will float if the gravitational force is less than the buoyancy force. So in other words, an object will float if it weighs less than the amount of water it displaces. Boats float because the water resists the weight of the boat, and the boat displaces the water. Objects like rocks sink because, although they're heavy, they displace only a little water. For any person to stand on a depth of water, say like the average depth of the Sea of Galilee, their total body weight divided by 8 pounds will tell you how many gallons of water his or her feet would have to displace. So a 160-pound man would have to displace 20 gallons of water with each step. Is that what the authors of the Gospels are trying to communicate to their readers? That that's what Jesus is doing? With each step, he's pushing away 20 gallons of water? My friends, you cannot know what the Bible means until you realize what the Bible meant. One difficulty 21st century Western people have is that, according to our consensus reality, there exist laws of nature. And that is why we have a good post-Enlightenment definition of miracle as something contrary to the laws of nature. So with that in mind, let me tell you a little story about my friend, Stephen. Stephen is a really good man. He's brilliant, he's funny, and like all of us, he lives in the 21st century Western world. He is deeply concerned about the problems in the world and suffering and injustice. And he doesn't just think about it, he tries to do something about it and help people. In addition to all of that, Stephen is a committed Catholic Christian, and he is a catechist, a religious instructor. Stephen reads in the Gospels the story about Jesus walking on the sea, and Stephen concludes that this story is informing readers that Jesus has the power to override or defy the laws of nature, the scientific laws, physical laws governing the universe. And Stephen also says, I believe this report. I believe Jesus can do that. Okay, let me also tell you about another friend of mine named Ricky. Ricky also, like all of us and Stephen, lives in the 21st century Western world. Ricky also happens to be a brilliant, funny, and deeply compassionate man. He is deeply concerned about the terrible problems that face us today. And he doesn't just think about them, he tries to do something about them. Like Stephen, he is a very good man. Ricky also reads the Bible and reads the story of Jesus walking on the sea. And like Stephen, Ricky concludes that the story is trying to communicate that Jesus has the power to defy the laws of physics, the laws governing the universe, the laws of nature. And to this report, Ricky says, this is complete and utter bullshit. It's absurdity. It's not true. I don't believe this. Two wonderfully good, brilliant, funny, deeply compassionate men, both of whom read the same story in the Gospels and conclude that the story is trying to say, or proposing for the reader, that Jesus has the power to override or defy the laws governing the universe. Stephen accepts the report as true. Ricky thinks it's hogwash, nonsense, absurd. He rejects it as untrue. But do you know something that these two 21st century men have in common? Besides being brilliant and funny and good men, they are both completely wrong about the story and its meaning. Both have misread the story anachronistically and ethnocentrically. They have distorted its meaning and they have misunderstood it. Indeed, there is no Greek or Hebrew word in the Bible that can be translated into our post-Enlightenment word miracle, meaning something contrary to the laws of nature. Science, laws of nature, and violations to the laws of nature are simply not part of the consensus reality of the authors of the Gospels or any biblical author or character. They could never have thought of stories like Jesus walking on the sea as a miracle. Try to understand. Consider the concept triangle. Isn't it true that before you can have the concept or idea of triangle, you first have to have grasped what an angle is? Doesn't angle logically come before triangle? And in the same way, this applies to miracles. A miracle is a violation of the physical laws governing the universe. But before you can understand what miracles are, don't you have to logically first have a concept of physical laws governing the universe? Don't you have to have a belief in a set of laws governing the natural order? If you don't have that, can you have miracle? Different works in the Old Testament speak of marvels and marvelous things and wonders, but we should never translate the Hebrew word wonder or marvel into miracle. I want you to consider a 21st century Israeli mom, delighted at her collegian daughter's fine grades at the university. When she exclaims in Hebrew, "Marvelous!" she is not declaring, "Wow, what a violation of the laws of nature. My dumb as dirt daughter did pretty well. She did an absurdity." No, she's not saying that. She is saying, "Marvelous! My very capable daughter studied hard, prepared very well, and applied herself, and look at this marvel that came about." Marvels and wonders. This is how God's deeds, God's acts, God's works are described in the Hebrew Bible. Not miracles, violations of the laws of the universe. They don't have a concept of laws governing the universe. I mean the biblical authors and the biblical characters. And there's no interventions in history. That's not how they think. Intervening implies that God is sometimes absent to the world. Is that how our biblical ancestors in the faith conceive of God? Sometimes the absent one? No. God is never the absent one. God is always the present one in the Bible. So no interventions and no miracles, wonders, marvels. And this is how Jesus' deeds are described in the New Testament. The Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, say that Jesus did mighty deeds. The fourth Gospel, John, says Jesus did signs and works, but no miracles. There are no miracles in the Bible, if by miracles we mean post-Enlightenment violations of physical laws, or the laws of nature, or scientific laws. I want you to think about this in light of Jesus walking on the sea. Next time, we're going to conclude with a culturally plausible understanding of what's going on exactly with Jesus being seen walking on the sea. In our last presentation, we spoke about Stephen and Ricky and how they were misreading the gospel story of Jesus walking on the sea as if it had been written by, for, and about Americans and other Western people. Even the most current studies attempting to understand the Jesus of history generally take little cognizance of the fact that he became incarnate in the ancient Mediterranean world. Anthropologists who specialize in this region and its literary records point out that approximately 90% of world cultures and 80% of circum-Mediterranean cultures readily experience altered states of consciousness. From the biblical record alone, which is included in the Anthropological Databank, it is evident that the people of this ancient culture were certainly among that 80%. Studies of Moroccan Jews in Israel are particularly enlightening in this regard. When they were forcibly repatriated to Israel in the 1950s and 1960s, the Moroccan Jews carried with them not only their personal belongings, but their beliefs, values, and traditions. They revitalized their practices and attached them to new sites and new saints to substitute for those they left behind. One of these takes place at the tomb of Rabbi Shimeon bar Yochai at Meren near Zaved. On the anniversary of his death, these devotees make a pilgrimage to his tomb, celebrate a picnic-like feast in the surrounding countryside, and expect to see him in a dream. And they do. The dream pattern typically has 4 elements, common in altered state of consciousness experiences, or ASC experiences for short. 1. Those experiencing the vision are initially frightened. And 2. Do not recognize the figure appearing before them. 3. The figure appearing before them offers calming assurance. Do not be afraid. And 4. Identifies herself or himself. It is I. Then the figure offers information. Maybe it's clarification of identity, or the granting of a favor, for example, healing or a healing strategy. The purpose of the experience is to illuminate a puzzle in life, or to suggest or approve a line of conduct. Notice that this is not a literary form. It is a pattern of human experience constructed by the culture rather than by someone's creative imagination. Jesus and those who knew him were quite familiar with and adept at experiences of alternate reality. Accounts of Jesus' baptism, transfiguration, walking on the Sea of Galilee, and post-death or post-resurrection appearances readily fit into the common Mediterranean cultural experiences of altered states of consciousness, even when the experience that is reported is so in an incomplete or selective manner. Aside from dreams and angelic appearances featured prominently in the infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke, the synoptics report 5 main incidents of such visions and/or appearances in the career of Jesus. The dunking of Jesus, also called his baptism, an experience in altered reality. The testing of Jesus, also called the temptation of Jesus, an experience in altered states of consciousness. Of course, walking on the sea stories, which we have been dealing with at some length in these presentations, another ASC experience. The transfiguration accounts of Jesus, another example of Jesus in altered reality. And of course, the resurrection appearances, also ASC experiences that we will deal with soon. When Jesus comes walking on the Sea of Galilee toward his disciples, 1. They are frightened. 2. They do not recognize Jesus, thinking instead that they are seeing a ghost. 3. Jesus calms them, "Be not afraid." 4. Jesus identifies himself, "It is I." So far so good for this being an example of an ASC experience. The document we call Matthew illustrates what happens when a person breaks the trance. The Matthean Peter is not convinced that he is really seeing the Matthean Jesus and demands, "If it is you, bid me to come to you on the water." Jesus says, "Come," and Peter progresses toward Jesus. But then the wind, the personified wind, startled him. His fear returns, his skepticism returns, and he began to sink, as will happen if one steps out of alternate reality back into consensual reality, out of the trance into a waking state. The trance experience will not continue in the waking state, just as a dream interrupted does not ordinarily resume after the interruption, despite diligent attempts to fall back asleep again into the dream. True to the style of high-context literature, the Gospels we call Mark and John do not report the meaning of this ASC experience. They presume that their intended audience knows it. While in the document called Mark, the disciples are utterly astounded and still puzzling over the multiplied loaves of bread, in the 4th Gospel we call John, they are glad to take him into the boat. The gospel called Matthew spells out the purpose, perhaps as the author we call Matthew sees it, understands it, interprets it. Jesus is the Son of God. This trance experience provides the disciples with yet another insight into the identity of Jesus, a new piece of information or further confirmation of an insight already known, but gradually deepening. Anthropological psychologists who specialize in ASC experiences emphasize that the content of these experiences is vacuous, hence Peter's doubt. You'll recall that visions do not come with soundtracks. Your culturally informed brain provides the soundtrack, meaning it provides the interpretation of what you're experiencing. It is the culture of the recipient to the vision that provides the information necessary to interpret the experience. Since all things come from God, we can say this is inspired from God. The cultural baggage also. And this is where the cultural baggage, the cultural information from both the Old Testament and from the pre-gospel reports from polytheistic traditions is relevant. This is where the parallels with Moses' power over the sea is relevant, as is Poseidon's rule over the sea is relevant. Narrow concentration on literal correspondences to construct the literary form, though, misses the forest for the trees. Both sources, whether it's Old Testament reports, like of Moses controlling the waves, parting the sea, or the pre-gospel polytheistic reports of Poseidon control of the sea, indicate that the activity of walking on the sea or making a pathway in the sea demonstrates that such a person is superior to and in control of the personified sea, whether he is riding a chariot on the waves or literally walking on its surface. The First Testament is particularly helpful here because it echoes a motif that occurs frequently in the Gospels. From the very beginning of Genesis, the second verse, the God of Israel is over the waters. God's breath or spirit or powerful wind is over and in control of the waves of the abyss. In the New Testament, Jesus seems to be doing something that only the God of Israel can do. In this case, walking on the sea. Now, do we conclude from that means these stories are saying Jesus is God? Hold on. It would be premature to conclude that from these stories alone, the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and John are claiming divinity for Jesus. We have to remember that doctrine develops, and it takes a long time to unpack all of these things and arrive at our Niceno-Constantinopolitan profession of faith. Centuries. We should not proof text our doctrines from these stories. It would be premature to conclude that Jesus is God from these stories alone. That isn't what the original audiences, the intended audiences of Mark, Matthew, and John would take from them. Rather, the intended audiences would recognize that Jesus is an extraordinary human being, one with a seemingly distinctive relationship to God, the one who normally behaves this way over the waters. Somehow, Jesus is able to do what only God can do. He must be authorized by God to do this. In the Hebrew tradition, this cumulative evidence would continue to build Jesus' reputation as a holy man, a chazid or tzaddik, that is, an Israelite shamanic figure who has a special relationship to the God of Israel and can barter special benefits or favors with alternate reality for fellow humans. He can navigate the worlds. Some concordances list the appearance of the risen Jesus in Luke chapter 24, verse 37, as a parallel to the story of Jesus walking on the sea. Actually, the elements of fear, lack of recognition, allaying of fear, and communication of new information or assurance of a course of action to be taken, common to ASC experiences, are quite normal in the resurrection appearances found in the Gospels, which are also experiences of a person's alternate reality, namely Jesus' alternate reality. Recall that these accounts of Jesus walking on the sea are culturally patterned experience, not a literary invention or creation or device. It is inappropriate, therefore, to consider the ASC experience of Jesus walking on the sea as a retrojected resurrection experience. It has often been repeated that the historical critical method is dead. It's been dead for over 50 years. It simply has not delivered what it promised. And what did it promise? To give us a clearer, more realistic picture of the historical Jesus. Perhaps the real problem is that the historical critical method has been neither sufficiently historical nor sufficiently critical. Cultural insights about the pan-human experience of alternate states of consciousness would enhance both literary critical and historical critical studies. In this light, the historical Jesus stands out ever so clearly as a typical person of his first century Mediterranean culture.